Welcome back, humanities students. In this brief screencast, I'm going to explain how to do reading response notes. This marking period, and towards the end of this marking period, you're going to read a novel called We Were Here, which was largely influenced by Of Mice and Men. And this time, as you read, you're going to be doing something called reading response notes, which is different from literature circle notes. And you're going to be recording responses on a document that we give you that will have literal responses, inferential responses, and critical responses. So in this screencast, I'm going to explain the difference between literal, inferential, and critical responses. Literal responses, which are abbreviated by L, are things that you can find directly in the text. It's like a fact. A way to think about it is if you can put your finger on it, it's a literal response. So here's an example, and notice how I coded it with L in the beginning. You could also code it with the L at the end. So here's an example. George and Lenny travel together. Well, that's a fact. I can find it in the text. Another example from Gatsby. Myrtle doesn't take care of her dog. The elevator boy feeds it. That's another fact from the text, and those are examples of literal thinking. You might want to take notes on literal things to remember what happens in the text or for things you think are important. Another way to monitor your thinking as you read is by writing down inferences, and that's going to be abbreviated by I. Inferences are things that aren't directly in the text, but there's enough evidence that you can kind of infer it or guess that it's happening. So here's an example, and again, notice I coded it with I at the beginning. George cares for Lenny like a brother. Well, that's not directly stated in the text, but there's enough evidence in the text for me to kind of make that guess. So that's an inference. Here's another example from Gatsby. The other characters at Myrtle's apartment were all focused on changing their social status. Well, that's true, but it's not directly stated in the text. I can infer that by the conversations the characters are having in chapter 2. The other kind of way to monitor your understanding as you're reading is something called critical thinking. And this is going to be the most familiar to you because in your literature circle notes, we asked you guys to write questions and select passages and connect to the text in those passages as you were writing about them. Critical thinking responses include your opinions, your thoughts, connections to the outside world or to other texts, or questions that you want to ask. And they may include words like I think or I believe, and that's how you know that these are critical responses. So look at the first example from Of Mice and Men, and notice how I coded it as CR. George gets frustrated with Lenny, and I think he should just leave him instead of yelling at him. Well, that's my opinion, so that's a critical response. Look at the second example. George doesn't seem to get much from the friendship. This reminds me of my sister and her boyfriend, ... And that's another critical response because I'm connecting it to something in my own life, and maybe I would elaborate in my response. Let's look at the third one. Nick is unreliable. He pretends to be the only guy who cared about Gatsby, but if he did, why would he set him up with his own married cousin? I guess that's a question, and that might be something that I'd bring up in discussion, and questions are critical responses as well. When you read We Were Here, we're going to split the book up into 3 sections. And at the top of those notes, you'll see a rubric that looks like this. And you'll notice that the rubric has 2 categories, one for reading habits and one for your process of reading or the quality of the responses. So notice that this time you'll be evaluated how well you're using the class time for reading, if you're completing the required pages, and if you're completing the responses that are needed per day. You'll also be evaluated on the quality of your literal, inferential, and your critical thinking from the text. When you turn in your document that will be pushed out to you on Schoology, you'll notice that we've already pre-slugged the pages in there for you. So you'll see that at the top of the document, the pages will be in bold, the page range, and you'll simply put the page number and then your responses for that section. You could do more than 4 if you really want to. You don't have to. And notice that here I have a variety of responses, and I coded them in the beginning or the end. It really doesn't matter to us as long as you code them. So let's review what I just said. For We Were Here, you're going to be writing reading response notes And as you read, you'll write at least 4 responses for every 20 pages. You're going to code each response with either an L, an I, or a CR. L is literal, I is inferential, and CR is critical response, and you want to aim for a variety. The book will be divided into 3 sections, and your notes are going to be due each Wednesday in January. First on Turnitin, and then you'll submit it to us in Schoology for a grade. Your notes will be worth 60 points each. Note that this time after the book is over is when we'll have our discussion instead of breaking it up into 3 sections. Okay, thanks for watching, and go ahead into Schoology and take the quiz to prove your understanding of the reading response notes.